David needs much of an introduction. David has done everything. He currently is the Associate Professor of Planning and Placemaking at the Pratt Institute. He was the chair of the Center for Active Design. He was the Commissioner of New York City Department of Design and Construction. He's currently their interim executive director at the AA and the Center for Architecture. So maybe before I jump into the questions that you all have submitted, which have been great, I'll just ask David just to talk a little bit about your career path and kind of how you got here, just to get things started.
Wow. Do you want the long and sorted version or the quick?
Yes, of course.
More sorted.
Well, I'm an architect. If I start at the beginning, I was born in Liverpool, which is a pretty, or at least at the time, was a pretty scruffy industrial shipping port. And I went to school there, and then I spent 3 years in Karachi, Pakistan, at an international school there. If you've ever been to Karachi, Pakistan, it's like the armpit of the universe. It's just a dreadful place. I think it's gotten worse. Pakistan's a beautiful country, but Karachi is not its finest point. And then we moved back to Britain, and I went to Edinburgh. Anybody know Edinburgh?
Yeah.
Edinburgh is an incredibly beautiful city. It has an old medieval town, has a Georgian new town designed by the Adam brothers in the 18th century. And I was like, wow, you know, cities didn't have to be like Karachi. They could be like Edinburgh, you know? So that's how I kind of got interested in architecture. And then my father was a mechanical engineer, so he got me an internship at an architect's office where I spent a year drawing the alphabet with a T-square and compass and so on, and running out for coffee and donuts. And then I went to Edinburgh College of Art. I went to architecture school in Edinburgh, and then I worked in London for an architect's office for a while, and then I came to New York. Really just, the firm I was working with in London had a relationship with David Burney, the design firm in New York. And we originally came over, I had done a housing project in Dockland in London, and they were doing an RFP on the Hudson River. And it so happened at the time, I think interest rates were 16% or something, and they were half that in England, and we had a developer. It's the kind of thing Jonathan would do. That, you know, brought the developer over, we said, okay, we're going to do this RFP, we're going to do a joint venture with David Burney. So I stayed at David Burney for a while. This RFP, by the way, has not yet come out. I'm talking about 1982, this one, but still hasn't come out. So then I just got addicted to New York, and I was there, and I stayed a bit longer, and I went back, and I came back again, and then eventually I called the London firm and said, you know what, I'm not coming back. So then I had like the American wife, the dog, the kids, it was all over. I didn't say anything. But then, so what's interesting was, so he was, was an architect, and those of you that do work in the public sector, it's amazing how much responsibility and how much influence you have as an architect working in the public sector. It's really quite empowering. So I was at NYCHA for a dozen years, and then when Bloomberg came into...
What do you think, or is there a distinction between public and private? And is that still a relevant discussion in planning and designing of spaces? Did I drop off there? People hear me okay? Okay.
So public and private meaning?
So my guess, this question is referring to how we talk about public architecture, impactful design, architecture in the public realm, socially impactful versus regular architecture?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways of thinking.
The person who wrote this question is here?
Oh, good.
Are they here?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, stand up.
Hi.
Tell us what you mean.
I guess, the blending of what is kind of public space as, I'm curious where that distinction is, and like when we just say something is, how do I want to describe this? I wrote it like 2 weeks ago, sorry. There's a moment where we're talking about kind of space as in the private realm. I don't remember. restaurant. It's like somebody else. Anybody?
Are you thinking like social justice projects versus?
But when isn't everything at this point a social justice
if
project?
I'm a roommate and a publicist, can I tell you?
Yes, please.
Okay, you can talk for me.
We spend a lot. We're both affiliated with Architecture Humanity, and we spend a lot of time thinking about who owns the project, right? So is it whether that's financially based or like zoning based or whatever? Like you have different people who are influencing how a project gets done and who it serves. Sometimes those interests are private, and sometimes they're public. And I think that's where she was going.
Right. So I think maybe the general question is around ownership and agency of a particular project.
Good, great. I thought you said these are going to be easy questions. Like, what are you supposed to do here? I don't know. I think there's two ways of thinking about that question. One is how a project's created and funded, and there's a public, there's a private part of that. But of course, some of those private funded things are also publicly accessible. And then there's the extent to which the public sector is actually responsible for sort of building the city. And I remember one Columbia student, when I was at review, one said to me, well, why doesn't the city just build everything? Which is kind of an interesting thought, right? I guess if you were Pope Pius VI, that's what you did, right? But we don't do that. So we do have these strange collaborations between what the private sector does and what the public sector does. And the public sector does control to some extent, or limits the way the private sector builds. And it's interesting in New York, it's different from other cities. In London, there are a lot more planning constraints on what the private sector can do. Every project gets planning reviewed, so like everything is ULEPed, and there's a lot of discretion. In this city, traditionally, we've only controlled two things. Use, in other words, you can't build factories in residential neighborhoods, and bulk. There's a sense of how much the city infrastructure can support, and we limit the size of development to prevent overloading the infrastructure, essentially. And after that, there's not really very much in terms of control. What was interesting to me, actually, when I started working in the government sector, is how much of the city is actually, if not directly built, at least controlled by the public sector. So if you think about 26 or 27% of all of the city is streets and pavings, streetscape, plazas, and so on. And then you've got the sort of standard public works like libraries, health centers, police stations, firehouses, museums, correction facilities, and so on. There's really a significant amount of the public realm that's actually, of the city that's actually public realm and publicly built. So I think that the sort of relationship between the city and the private sector, I'm not quite sure what the balance is, but I always get the sense that there's quite a lot more public sector than you might think. And then in terms of private use, the famous one to talk about are the POPs, the privately owned public spaces, where in return for additional bulk, developers are required to provide public space, public amenities. And that's been a long-running battle, a battle which the city normally loses, because then the developers used to go back and privatize the public space, or it wasn't, the benefit accrued was far less than the size of the building that was increased. And I think we're getting better at that. I think the new POPs rules are much better, and some of the new privately owned public spaces have really improved on the older ones, but that's a continuing dialogue.
That actually brings about this next question about the sense of ownership and how do we kind of shift. I might be paraphrasing this question, so I'm sorry. But shift the ownership more from the developers to the communities and people who are going to be using these spaces. I can read you the exact question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How to create sense of ownership and belonging to the public space among communities.
Okay, there's an easy answer to that.
Right, but I'm trying to get to the harder one.
There's an easy answer to that, and that is you start with the community, right? I mean, the reason public spaces are built and then abandoned is that they're not built to the purpose of the social need that they're supposed to address, right? So successful public space, to my mind, has to start with the community that you're serving. Has to start, I mean, the difference between space and place, as Li Tu Fuan has always pointed out, is that place answers a human perspective. It's not just a geographical Euclidean definition. It's a place and not a space because it's meeting a human need. It's serving a social function. It's a place of meaning and memory. So if you start with that and have the place that you're designing respond to that, you're going to have a successful place, one that people have ownership of, that people value, and so on. Anybody disagrees or wants to chip in, this is like a conversation. It's not supposed to be a lecture.
Yeah, we feel a little bit funny right up here, so please feel free to. Yes, thank you. Oh, was your question? Okay, great. Stand up.
So the question is kind of that there are existing places from which communities feel excluded for whatever reason. So how do you solve that problem? And I think the answer is often programming. If you look at what happened in Corona Plaza, and Killian Rihanna's, I saw him in the background somewhere. Killian, how are you? Killian can talk about this. I mean, Corona Plaza was an existing plaza in Queens that was really underutilized, that the local predominantly Latino community did not feel ownership of and didn't use well. And it was through programming and involving the community and having events there, public art and so on, that now it's like incredible. There's stuff going on all the time in Corona Plaza. So I think ideally you design the place from the beginning to suit, but even if you haven't done that, you can go back and you can engage communities. I mean, it takes effort, it takes work, it takes it takes a community that's willing to engage and wants to have the space. But I think would be the way to do it. Do you want to say anything about Corona Plaza?
I guess the only thing I'll say around that is that one was an institution. What to me was very important that it's an institutional player. The Queens Museum was the one who began to do a lot of that work leading up to it, beginning to bring programming like it wasn't usually had. And also change the design process in the model. So I think that the one thing that it would have been really kind of nice to take further in that process would have been how the design comes out of the specific kind of uses and people and groups that are there.
Please go ahead.
How are you going to keep it going? You have a programming that is directed by.
The Queens Museum is the programming partner for now. One of the things that you're talking about, the sustainability, is one thing that we were looking at with a studio last semester, which we looked at how a business improvement district was actually going to be used as the maintenance partner from now on, and then the Queens Museum, it wasn't 100% sure whether or not they're going to be able to continue. But the sustainability question, especially with some of the faster, quicker plazas, it becomes a big issue.
That is a problem. If you're Times Square, for example, they have like a $50 million budget. There's huge resources around Times Square. If you're a small plaza in an outer borough, it can be a struggle to just even keeping up with maintenance, running programming. All of these things require resources. And there's an organization now called the Neighborhood Plaza Alliance that Laura Hansen runs, that's helping to nurture those small organizations. There are organizational challenges as well as financial challenges, but that's the kind of thing that Killian's talking about. The long-term sustainability certainly needs work.
So to nuance that question, let's take a really successful place that is used by people, but it's not all the people, it's not inclusive. So I live in Fort Greene, Walt Whitman, NYCHA Properties is there. I consult for NYCHA. And what I don't feel like that's their park. They don't go into the park. They don't utilize the park. And it's one of the most successful parks I've ever been to across the U.S. And there's a disconnect there about ownership and who has the right to it. Because I see a lot of people in the park that feel like that's their park. But it's not a lot of the residents that have lived there generationally. And I find that to be an interesting nuance. And how do you overcome programmatically, and who becomes responsible for that programming in a successful park that doesn't really need extra people? You know, if you want to truly engage, whose responsibility is that? Parks, Park and Rec, NYCHA?
Nadine has more experience. I mean, this is a really good question, and I think it's a recurring question, not just in Fort Greene, but you've been involved in Brownsville and so on.
That's a fantastic question, a really complicated one to address. I think, you know, going to Killian's point about the programming, and then to David's earlier point about the resident engagement. So how do you create potentially, you know, get away from all the different agencies that might not be talking to each other. So is it NYCHA? Is it DOT? Is it sanitation? There's kind of, you need to step outside of that and then go directly to the resident, figure out a way to work with the residents and do programming around that. And then you can start engaging back with those agencies, because you need the agencies. It's not to say that you're not going to do the work with the agencies, but I think there needs to be some sort of way for the community voices to be heard, and then creating an implementable strategy. So let's say maybe the residents in this particular park want to have a Tai Chi or something, I don't know. So there might be ways. Oh, Deborah, yes. Oh, yes, I don't know.
Yeah, I would say that community used to be in the park, and as the neighborhoods got gentrified, it's not.
So the community feels like
Sorry.
they're getting pushed out, I guess, right? Yeah, it's a really, yeah.
You know,
Robert?
Question for David. Is it an aesthetic question?
It isn't an aesthetic question. I don't know if I'd use the word aesthetic. I'd say, first of all, Seth Alone, who teaches at Pratt and teaches at CUNY, has written extensively about this, about the issue of social justice in space and the fact that many public spaces are places of exclusion. You know, a particular ethnic group takes them over, other people don't feel comfortable going there, so there's that fundamental question of whose interest does it serve, and then how do you share spaces between people of different values and so on. And that's a constant struggle. I don't know that it's an aesthetic question, but I think it's a design question. I think there are ways to design to suit, but you have to have a really deep understanding of what you're designing for, and you have to be prepared to change it. You know, there's I love Project for Public Spaces. I don't know anybody hears from PPS, but they have one shibboleth, which is you don't know the answer and you're never finished, right? And if you remember those two things, you'll be more successful.
I think that and you're never finished is, ooh, sorry. Yeah.
My name is Nancy Owens. I'm a landscape architect and consultant to the Parks Department, and I'm doing the management master plan for Fort Greene Park. And there's a very strong advocacy defense of Fort Greene Park, and it is very complex and it is changing over time. And it's just interesting for you. We're talking about the residents in housing that were there are being not used. That park is divided socially, how it's used, and how maintenance is perceived, and what capital money goes into the park. And I do think we had a community listening session recently, and this current Parks Commissioner is very sensitive to that voice of the community. So I do think it's changing. I've been working on this for 3 or 4 years. The reconstruction ability of an entrance is an ongoing
maybe around the definition of what design is, and that design doesn't necessarily stop at the end of an architect's involvement, but that a project is designed to continue, as you were just saying, like your project never ends. There is a life after the architect might not have a contract.
I would just say I'm one of those old white guys that goes there to play tennis, so please don't take away the tennis courts. In public space in particular, you're talking about? So if you don't hear it, the question is, are there examples of the community initiating requests for public space or public space improvements rather than the city being sort of top down? I think the city's tried to stimulate that. As part of the DOT Plaza program, they put out a sort of casting call to the city through the community board saying, if anybody wants more public space, you can just apply through the community board and we'll look at it. So those requests came in and there was an analysis process, and DOT ran it through a filter of was it technically feasible and was there a community group to support and sustain it, and then if you passed muster through that gate, then they would go on and fund it, sort of a process. So that was certainly one way of getting more community engagement. I think that, well, I don't know whether to get into this topic, because the whole community board process, they were originally set up in the Lindsay administration to be sort of mini town halls, to be mini planning agencies that would garner sort of community needs and then float them up to the city for action. And because they were never properly funded and they were never given the technical expertise, they ended up not really fulfilling that mission. And I think one of the things that we've talked about in recent years is finding ways to re-energize the community boards and give them technical help and so on. And actually that's been happening slowly. They're actually getting a lot of prep students helping them with planning issues. But I think that's something that could be stronger and could be reinvigorated. Yes.
One of the things that I've seen recently in regards to that was the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. They have the SMAP program that is across the city, 15 NYCHA communities, Mayor's Action Plan. And what they did was create these action labs on these community sites, and really it was about creating 100-day goals that was driven by the residents. What did the residents want to see? What did they perceive what was their perception of safety and what was the actual safety, and create 100-day goals around that. And that's a plan that's being implemented right now. It's community-led. Yeah.
Hi. I wanted to, recently, the mayor of Medellin, Colombia, and the planner from Colombia were at the Center of Architecture. And one of the things that they did in their initiatives in creating public spaces, they actually did a lot of homework, research with the community to sort of find out what the community really wanted, what their fears and so forth, and to some extent educate them before they actually did the implementations. And I hear from Nancy that Parks is doing something like that. I wonder if, I know there's a tremendous disconnect in the city between, as you mentioned, different groups of people and public spaces, and people really don't know. In many communities, in this neighborhood, everyone knows how to use public space, but in other neighborhoods uptown, many do not. So the question is, are there the idea that the city actually, the mayor's office, whoever, making initiatives to actually do public outreach, help educate people, to show them what's possible, to find out what their needs are. It seems to work in Colombia because they can Beijing, because they learn the most dangerous city around to modern safe city today.
Yeah, point taken.
Yeah. So maybe we'll switch over a little bit towards the placemaking, and I'll go back to some of the questions I missed, but I think we're headed in this direction regarding why is placemaking important and what are its benefits and how can we improve the process.
Okay, so this term placemaking, it's so au courant now, but nobody really knows what they're talking about when they say placemaking, so we should probably sort of try to start with that. And I think it's because there has been this sort of paradigm shift between planners who tend to think about cities in terms of systems, transportation and economics and so on, and architects who think about form. And when you do those two things in traditional city planning, you end up with the acronym we used to use in architecture school was SLOP, space left over after planning. And that was public space, you know, it was the bits that got left in between all the other things you've done. And then we wondered why the sort of public realm wasn't really that great, you know. So the idea was to, as Jan Gehl says, you know, first people, places, then the buildings, you know. The other way around just doesn't work. And I think, I don't know why it's taken so long, but I think there's now a realization that successful, walkable, livable cities really depend on that paradigm. You have to think about space first, to make sure the public realm is working. And then everything else will take care of itself, in a sense. And I think, to me, that's really what placemaking is about. And you do have to start with people. There are lots of public spaces that are not places. You know, abandoned places, parking lots, you know, highways, lots of public space that's not place. So, but when you start with people and you make them responsive to social activity, then I think you have successful placemaking. And I think increasingly, as people are moving back to the cities, there's this huge need for public space for social interaction. It's just, you know, the sort of pressure on public space is greater and greater. And there's a third thing that's happening, which is the sort of globalization of the economy and the homogenization of culture and the kind of homogeneity of urban design. If you look at cities in Korea and China and the Middle East, they're all the same, right? So it seems to me that there's this huge yearning for idiosyncratic space, that space that's particular to the culture that it's serving, spaces that are full of meaning, that are full of memory, that are kind of the antidote to the homogenization of culture. I think that's another reason why place is becoming so important. If anybody disagrees, they should just
So I'm guessing this was rhetorical. I'm going to read it exactly. Do you believe that great public art promoting environmental awareness strengthens cities by making them more attractive and exciting places to live and visit?
Oh, public art. I can tell you some war stories about public art. I think the simple answer is yes, but it's not as easy as it seems. When I was working at DDC, we had a percent for art program, you know. Public plazas took a percentage, 1%, and you spent it on public art. And sometimes we did. I can think of some successful examples. We did a plaza in Upper Manhattan, Harriet Tubman Plaza, where we had a really nice little plaza. There was a statue of Harriet Tubman, and there was some historical text, and it was like a really nice place. There were other examples that were not so successful. We did a plaza. People know who Roberto Clemente was? He was like this Dominican baseball player, philanthropist, died in a plane crash, and so on. And they named the plaza after him in the Bronx. So we were it was an existing plaza, but it was being redone and expanded. And the way the system works, the Department of Cultural Affairs selects the artist, and we work with the community to come up with the design, right? So the community, of course, wanted a bronze statue of Roberto swinging the bat, you know? And the Department of Cultural Affairs, like, bring in Richard Serra, you know? It actually wasn't Richard Serra, but something like that, you can imagine. So you can imagine the community meetings, right? Trying to resolve these two conflicting cultures. And what we ended up with was kind of neither one nor the other, a kind of rather lame version, compromise. It was pretty dreadful. So I was made the argument. I thought that public art should be temporary, because if art's going to be worth anything, it has to be avant-garde, cutting edge, and 95% of it is going to be crap, right? Otherwise, you're not really pushing the envelope, right? And so you would do it as temporary, and then you would go back a year later and you could change it, right? And then it would perhaps be more vibrant and more successful. But I do think I would like to see more evidence. Actually, I would like. One of the things we're doing at Pratt actually is going back and trying to assess what was the impact of public art. Did it, in fact, do the things that the question is? Did it increase public participation? Did people value it? Did it become embedded meaning to the space, or was it just ignored? So it's interesting to know that. I used to anchor for the days when, if you worked with a city, public art was, you took a general, you put him on a horse, and you were done. It was easier that way.
So it seems like you're making a connection potentially around public art and quote-unquote placemaking or ongoing programming?
Yes, I think so. I think that public art's another way of enriching and bringing meaning to public space, but it has to be appropriate, and it has to be, well, I think it should be challenging as well. I don't think there's anything wrong. Did anybody hear about the pink reclining lady at Queen's Plaza? You know about that, Colleen, don't you? So there's another controversial thing where the artist was commissioned, put down a sculpture of a reclining figure in bright pink, and the community hated it. They made them take it away eventually, right? I think they took it out. So I thought that was great, actually. It brought enormous attention to what had been a really sort of unknown public space. So it was provocative, right? And I think if that had been a temporary piece, then it would have been just as effective.
So maybe we'll switch gears over to housing. So if the person who wrote this question is here, I'm making the assumption that you're referring to public housing, if that's not the case. So the question is, what are your thoughts on reskinning? That was the whole sentence. So my assumption is reskinning as
reskinning meaning for energy conservation?
My assumption it's exterior facades on public housing campuses.
You know, there's one example that I think was really successful. It was out in the Rockaways. Alan Ann took over an old Section 8 development that was a precast concrete thing. It was leaking like a sieve, and it had all sorts of other issues as well. And they reclad it with an EIFS system, and it looked terrific. And they did a lot of other stuff that really, they re-tenanted it. It was very successful, and I think there's been discussions at NYCHA about doing similar things, because one of NYCHA's issues is its energy bill is colossal, because these buildings built in the 40s and 50s are not very energy efficient, and there's not much you can do on the inside, but if you reclad them, yeah, sure, why not? I don't see any reason not to.
Jonathan?
Dave, talk a little bit about Tillman and the reskinning in Tillman.
I'm not supposed to be answering the questions. So I've been working on a project with Community Solutions on looking at scenarios for reskinning public housing, and so maybe that's sort of where I went with this question.
This was your question, then?
Yeah. And so it was just looking at reskinning as one of several things that need to happen on a public housing development. Reskinning being one of them, but it wouldn't be enough to just reskin a building if you weren't also looking at the sort of maybe less sexy stuff like the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, and sort of the interior spaces, and sort of the entire landscape. And so reskinning is a component of the development, and then as an inclusive in that study is how do you engage the community, so that this is sort of by reskinning, by doing these other things within the buildings and on the campus, that we are tackling what the community wants us to tackle. And that community is not just NYCHA residents, it's the community in which these campuses reside, it's the neighborhoods as well. And so how do we, it's a lot. So my thought, reskinning is not enough. It's one thing to do as part of a whole system approach.
Well, Berlin is a great example too, right? East Berlin, right, was entirely reskinned. Changes the nature of the neighborhood pretty rapidly, for better or worse.
Yes?
So to segue on reskinning, because I'm part of the project management team doing all the Sandy recovery, and obviously facades are a big problem that we're trying to address, but can you segue that and say, through the process of reskinning, what other things have you seen as solutions coupled in with it? Because no thing should do just one thing. It should do like 8 things. And how do you tie in air quality improvements? And how do you tie in, eliminating the need for AC units that fall out of the window holes? And how do you tie in running some sort of solar thermal water heating device through it? I mean, I want to hear how reskinning can be a solution for a lot of other ails, right? Not just reskinning.
I don't know if reskinning is a solution to solve other problems, but it certainly could be part of a more comprehensive approach. At L&M, at the Alvan View project, they didn't just do the reskinning, they did a lot of interior work as well. They spent a lot of time actually on the ground plane, improving the lobbies, improving the grounds, opening up commercial space that had been vacant for years, and bringing back retail into the development. So it was they did tackle it on a broad scale. They didn't just reskin and then leave the rest of it as it had been. So I don't know that they changed the heating and cooling system other than replacing and upgrading the boilers and the boiler control systems. They would still, traditional heating and cooling. They didn't do solar or geothermal or anything like that, but it was part of the comprehensive change.
So are we good on the reskinning? Is there any other? Okay. So how can we better integrate the worlds of architecture and planning so that professionals in both worlds work together? And do you see placemaking as a way for these professionals to collaborate?
Well, the trouble with professionals is the professions. We didn't used to have professions. They used to be, architects used to be part of the construction team. They came out of the masonry trades, and there's a great book that tells you all about this by Terence Johnson called Professions in Power, and it's all about why professionals emerged as a way of controlling a market, really. So what professionals tend to do is to say, we know how to do this best, talk to us, don't talk to the other guys, and that's why there's been such sort of bifurcation of the design and construction industry. So planners, architects, construction managers, landscape and so on, all sort of trying to monopolize their particular area of expertise to the exclusion of others, which they found necessary in order to maintain that market share, but it doesn't help very much in terms of collaboration. I think part of it starts with education, frankly, because we teach these things in such silo ways. I was talking to Phil earlier about at Pratt, we're trying to run integrated studios where planners and architects work together. So we've got 5 programs in the planning school. We've got basic city and regional planning, historic preservation, facility management, one called Sustainable Environmental Systems, which is all about sort of water management and so on, and now one on placemaking. And the students actually work on joint studios, they work together. And we've tried to bring architects in as well. That's been more challenging because they have different scheduling issues. But even just the relationship between historic preservation and planning has been really enriching, because the way Pratt teaches historic preservation is not so much to do with the materiality of it. You don't learn how to repair a marble wall. It's all about cultural preservation. What is the meaning of the cultural meaning of architecture in the community? So they have a very different way of looking at community, and then they work with the planners, and the two together really sort of worked off each other in a very enriching way. So I think the schools are responsible for a lot of the siloing of the professions, and I think we need to do more to have joint, because what happens is architects, particularly, they spend their 5 years in this cocoon, and then they go out into the world, and all of a sudden they realize it's a team game. They got to work with everybody else, and they didn't learn that in school. They learned how to be Howard Rourke. So it's a big issue in the schools. I think the schools have to change the way they teach. Placemaking, yes, because placemaking is the one arena where everybody has to come together. And the placemaking, that's really why we developed the placemaking curriculum at Pratt, because you start with community engagement, and that's a particular skill set, with programming, with ethnography, and then into design, landscape, urban design, sustainable design, and then you've got things like high street economics, economic vitality, long-term maintenance, programming, public art. There's a whole series of disciplines that are involved in successful placemaking, and you have to understand the role that they all play, how they fit together, and how to nurture them. And I think that's one way in which we will get more integration of those professions. Yes.
Go ahead. Yes, please.
Sort of as a follow-up to that, I agree with you. I think the lines we draw in our disciplines are more problematic than they are helpful. But nonetheless, people want to be organized somehow. So, even just in that anecdote about Pratt, like we see is the end user, the community, a good organizing tool, is the outcome, social engagement, a good organizing tool, and geography, a good organizing tool. Like if we're gonna have to move it a little bit just to be functional, like if it's not discipline, what is it?
I mean, I don't think those disciplines are going to go away. There's so much knowledge that some form of specialization is inevitable, I think. But the point is seeing the role that each plays, and not to be exclusive, and not to be arrogant enough to think that you're the only solution. I think that's the answer. And then if you work together in a sort of non-egotistical way, I think that's much more successful.
More of a collaborative understanding there's a collaborative process in development.
That's right. And I think it can be difficult because the way we're often trained is that we know the answer, right? We know how to do this and so on. And when we started the placemaking program, a lot of the other disciplines within the school, the design people said, "Oh no, we already do that." And the landscape, "Oh yeah, we already do that." Everybody thinks they're already doing it, but they're not seeing the whole picture. They're seeing it through a very narrow lens. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's almost like you have to step back and see it more holistically, and that can be challenging if you're trained in a particular discipline.
Mm-hmm. So I was recently asked this question around what our profession, as in the architecture profession, could do better around social impactful design. I was curious what your thoughts were on that in light of this conversation, and then also in light of the question that I have here around what the AIA plans to implement and what is appropriate for a professional organization like the AIA to be supportive of you or not.
It always strikes me as odd that architects, for the most part, are a pretty liberal group. Architects, planners, people who put environment, and they bitch and moan about government policy that doesn't support social housing and so on. But they're so reluctant to get involved in the actual process. How many architects run for? How many architects in the Senate? I think it's like one, right? How many architects in the Congress? It's like two. And for those of you who've been in government service at all, you quickly realise, wow, if there were more architects in government, both as elected officials and as administrators and so on. Look how much impact Sean Donovan had, going to HUD, going HPD and then to HUD. we got to get more involved. You know, we just got to get out there and participate and be involved in the political process. And if you want to change policy, that's what you have to do. You cannot just be wailing all the time about how this the government's not doing it. So I think that's one thing. And then I think the second thing is that, that there is this mindset among many people that design, particularly architectural design, is like a thing for the 1%, and it's not helped by all these towers going up in Midtown, selling for 100 million. It just kind of reinforces that impression. And I think we have to change that mindset somehow, and this is something that AIA is going to be working on, that design is really an equity issue, that, you know, everybody deserves good design, and the lower the budget, the more you need good design. So it's more important for the lower end of the market than it is for the 1%. So that's another mindset change, I think, a cultural change that we have to get across.
Did everyone hear that? That's everything that we're talking about. So, yeah, please.
I actually just read recently that this is a very European point of view of architectural revolution, that social aspects, including in modern architecture, which didn't translate to America. So I hope that you're right and this is finally happening in Germany. In America.
We had a very depressing show last year on Viennese social housing. And there was just like so much of it, it was embarrassing. You know, we got to get there somehow.
So maybe I'll just end with this last. Okay, so we'll ask this question, and then maybe we could, but will you consider staying on as the AIA executive director? I had to ask for you.
I should say something about that. It was you, Mary, wasn't it? No. There's a lot of interesting things going on at the AIA, as there are in IPA. But the AIA has recently sort of changed into two separate organizations. So the chapter, AIA New York chapter, which is has 5,000 members, it serves the architectural community, remains as is, but the Center for Architecture is now a separate 501c3, and the idea is it has a separate board and so on. And there were a couple of reasons for that, but one, the biggest one, it keeps on growing as a cultural institution. It's going to become, it is really, after the Met and MoMA, the next big place where design and urbanism is represented and discussed in the city. It's the one, you know, because the League and MAS and so on all kind of lost their storefront spaces. It's now one of the last places that really has a storefront that's really a showcase for design and urban design. So I think going forward, it's already bursting at the seams. It's probably going to have to move to a bigger space. So part of the idea of creating the Center for Architecture separately was to liberate it from some of the constraints that are imposed as a result of AIA chapter, which is a function of national AIA and so on, and let it become the best it can be as a cultural institution, have really professional curatorial skills, I mean really kind of up its game to become, and then perhaps one day be like the old Urban Centre used to be, and offer space to the League and MAS and Storefront and Van Allen, so that it could be the place where everybody goes. Maybe have a bookstore again, have a restaurant, so on and so forth. But my joke was we're going to wait until they build that culture shed, and then when they don't know what to do with it, we're going to move the Centre for Architecture and everything. But it's a very exciting, I'm not going to do it, you know, it needs to be somebody dynamic and terrific will take it over. The next sort of Philippe de Montebello will walk in there and do the thing. It's a really exciting opportunity for somebody. And we got to get somebody, because I got to get out of there, because school starts the end of August. So if you want the job, let me know. I'll take your resumes.
So if we have, does everyone okay with more questions? Because I have more. You're okay, David?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Bring them on.
More drinks? Okay. So let me. So if anyone wants a drink, please feel free to get up and get a drink. So shifting to the waterfront, what should be the priority of New York City's waterfront, recreational or commercial, and can the two be mutually inclusive?
That's a good question. Anybody know Vancouver? I was in Vancouver a couple of months ago. Vancouver's probably got enough waterfront to do a city 20 times the size of Vancouver. They were very lucky because their industry was logging. There was no real sort of heavy industry, no smokestack stuff, there's no brownfields, there's no contamination. And as the logging industry declined, they just took over the waterfront, and it's beautiful. It's all recreational. They've got a continuous waterfront around Vancouver. It's fantastic. A lot of our waterfront is more challenging because it's still in industrial use. Con Edison's one of the big players. They've got their